Welcome into the newest edition of the Checkerboard Chat. We have a little midweek action for you, not in our normal Monday night spot, but big news this week, this Wednesday, is Tennessee hires Josh Heupel as its new head football coach coming from Orlando with Danny White. And I have Josh Lane here, the assistant sports editor at Daily Beacon, to talk to me. I'm Ryan Shcumpert, sports editor. A lot to get to, but Josh, what were your initial hires on Josh Heupel being hired as the Vols head coach?
Yeah, I got to say, at first, a little surprised. His name was on a couple lists, a couple of the hot boards and such, but he didn't really seem like the standout candidate to me until probably late Tuesday night, and right before he was hired. So a little surprised at first, but I think right now I'm kind of with where a lot of the fans are. Like, it's a solid hire. I don't hate it, but it's not blowing me away. I think he's got potential, but right now it's just a solid hire in my opinion.
Yeah, I think that's pretty accurate. I think most people are kind of in wait and see mode. I definitely think Danny White was saying this was our first choice. This was it may have been the only guy they officially offered a job to, but I know they talked to a lot of other guys. I don't think a whole lot of interest was reciprocated from a lot of the bigger names: Luke Fickell, Billy Napier, Matt Campbell. I think pretty widely reported that James Franklin did have some interest. They went down that road, but I don't think it's shocking that any of those guys said no, given the status of the Tennessee roster, the status of the NCAA investigation. It's frankly not the most appealing job right now. But when you get past those kind of top candidates, I think Josh Heupel is about as good as anybody. I mean, it's hard to say if he would have done better than X person, but looking at and with some foresight, I think he definitely brings potential. He gets the sitting head coach, I think, was a big thing that Danny White was looking for. And then the offensive-minded coach, I think, is what Tennessee needs. That's what Danny White's hired every single time, so I think that was kind of expected. But it is definitely in wait-and-see mode right now. What's, I guess, the positive, the excitement? What do you look at as being what makes Heupel a good fit at Tennessee and a guy that can have success?
Well, kind of as you mentioned, a very, very offensive-minded head coach, and specifically how he can develop quarterbacks. He's had a very good reputation with that. He was coaching Sam Bradford when he won the Heisman back in the day. He coached Drew Lock at Mississippi. He's gone on to have a good career. Landry Jones, just a couple guys there. He can really develop quarterbacks, and that's kind of been Tennessee's biggest issue over the last couple of years. I mean, it's been well documented. They've definitely struggled there. So that's area of big potential. That's kind of what's most exciting to Tennessee fans is that, if he can turn around Harrison Bailey or some other quarterback that Tennessee might have, then, we might be pretty good here in the future.
Yeah, and we're going to get into in a minute a little bit more from this press conference. But that's something I thought was maybe not the most impressive thing, but something he said yesterday that I thought came off very well is he was like, if you want to compete for championships, you got to have a championship caliber quarterback. And this isn't a bash Jeremy Pruitt podcast or anything, but I don't think Pruitt necessarily saw football that way. The old school defensive minded coach. And Tennessee's got a lot of catching up to do to get to Florida, Georgia, and Alabama. And there's just because you say you need a quarterback doesn't mean you'll get the right one and be perfect. But the best way for Tennessee to close that gap is to figure out the quarterback position.
Absolutely.
And especially if they could strike gold on a recruit. Like, I know Ty Simpson's a big name in the 2022 class. Alabama, Clemson after him hard. It's a guy I'm sure was probably one of Heupel's first calls yesterday. But I think that's really something that stands out about him. And you look his offenses at Central Florida in particular, top 10 scoring offense every year, top 25 in passing and rushing yards, I think every single year besides 2018, his first year there, they ranked 33rd in passing. So, I mean, I don't think there's hardly anything you look at what he did at Central Florida on offense side of the ball, and you can really scoff at. He had quarterbacks get injured. Obviously, Mackenzie Milton one's pretty well known what a gruesome injury that was, what a really good player he was, kind of derailed his career. But when you do go back to Missouri, which is, something I've been looking at, the numbers look good. I think in 2017 is his last year there. They finished first in the SEC in scoring per game. But the stats are kind of a little misleading there. You look at the numbers they played, 7 games against what I'm calling the bye opponents, the Idaho and Missouri State.
Mm-hmm.
They played UConn, which I'm guessing they weren't they didn't buy that game, but UConn's pretty bad. And then they played 4 teams that did not make a bowl game in the SEC. Florida went 4-7, Tennessee went 4-8, Arkansas went 4-8, Vandy went 5-7. In those 7 games, Missouri averaged 54 points a game. In their other 6 games, which included South Carolina, Purdue, Auburn, Kentucky, Georgia, and the bowl game against Texas, just 17 points per game. So very skewed there. Obviously, Missouri is not the most talented roster in the SEC. Drew Lock was a good quarterback, and UCF probably has been one of the most talented rosters in the AAC. So you don't expect the complete, same numbers, the same expectations at UCF that you would at Missouri. But I think that was a little bit of a concerning stat, I guess, for what he was been able to do in the SEC. The year before that, the stats are skewed a little bit too, but that was a really bad Missouri team that he was coming in and did not have a lot of talent. I think that was just Drew Lock's sophomore year. So I think it's a little less on that one, but certainly something to watch. And I don't know what you make of those numbers.
Yeah, well, I mean, you mentioned the offensive success he's had, but kind of to go along with that, I'd say on the flip side, teams he's been on have not had a great defense. And obviously, offensive coach, you can't really hold that against him, but it's just something that's there. And so, maybe with the high-powered offense that they've been running, they can afford, to beat up on the other team's mistakes. Won't hurt them necessarily, but playing a good team, playing a solid team, if you don't have a great defense, and it'll catch up with you regardless of how good your offense is. So I guess that's just something to look out for as he comes to Tennessee, but I'm sure we'll get to that later.
Yeah, and that's, this is a little bit more speculative. You wonder if it's some of those defensive numbers are kind of the way you see Alabama's defensive numbers be down and the way LSU's were down in 2019. Just the product of having an offense that goes that fast, you're going to give up some points. You wonder how much of it is that, but that's the huge unknown, and I think that's what we'll get to this a little bit more. But I think that's who he hires on the defensive staff is going to be the most important thing for him in the coming weeks. But obviously, we listened to Heupel talk for about 25, 30 minutes yesterday. Pretty classic introductory press conference stuff. I was talking to my dad. He was asking what the big takeaways were. I was like, this is the 5th time Tennessee's done it. There's only so much that everyone can say. But with that being said, what were some things that caught your eye that he talked about yesterday?
Yeah, well, first thing that caught my eye, he talked about recruiting. Obviously, that's not been his biggest strength. I don't think he's been terrible, but he could definitely stand to improve, especially compared to like where Pruitt was. That was one of his biggest strengths, was recruiting, and signing days coming up. So I'm, as you mentioned, calling quarterbacks, especially in-state people. There's a lot of great 4- and 5-star prospects in-state in Tennessee that often they'll go out of state. So I guess getting those in-state recruits is going to be very important to him. Another thing that he mentioned from the press conference was like the different styles of offense. They addressed that, how it's very fast-paced, spread offense, that type of thing, and that's very different from what Tennessee's running. And so there's, kind of maybe a disconnect there at first with just the 2 different philosophies, but he seemed very confident that between him and the coaches and the players and all the time they have between spring practice and between summer and everything coming up, they'll definitely be ready by the time season rolls around. And maybe the last biggest takeaway from me was he seemed passionate, and he seemed like he demanded a lot from his players. And, he wants his players at a high level, high energy all the time. And I think last year, and maybe especially towards the end of the year, that's an area where Tennessee kind of struggled. It looked like players weren't given as much energy, kind of lackluster performance. So I think that was very refreshing to hear.
Yeah, and the thing you said about the recruiting in state, I think that's a big thing. That's one of the reasons I thought it made a lot of sense for Tennessee to make a move away from Pruitt this year. Obviously, they're him to end up kind of being forced there. But you have that ability to – the 2022 class in the state of Tennessee is the best one probably since 2017. They have T. Higgins, Jacoby Stevens. A lot of guys go. Really, one of the ones that was one of Butch Jones's downfalls that he didn't get enough of those real good players in that class.
Sure.
So to have a coach kind of be able to sell the vision, that's recruiting in a school like Tennessee. Those first few years with the coach, it almost always goes pretty well just because you're selling the future, you're selling the vision, you have everything else to go around it, and you don't have to rely on winning. Some things that I thought stood out. One thing, he kind of downplayed the NCAA stuff, and really just as a whole, I think he put more expectations on himself for next year than I would expect a new coach to do. Now, he wasn't out there saying we're going to go win the SEC. He wasn't saying they're going to go win 6-7 games, but he and you touched on it there a second ago, he kind of scoffed off the idea that it was going to be a real hard transition to go from the pro style offense to the spread offense in 1 year. He said, I've done it in a lot of places. It's really not that big of a deal. You can almost do it 2 times is what he says. And then for him to, what I think he called it a speed bump, the NCAA stuff. And I'm sure some of that's just trying to be positive, put on a good face for recruits. But those 2 things, you're saying it's easy to change your offense and it's the recruiting violations are just a speed bump. You're kind of saying that there's no reason we can't be successful really from day one.
Yeah, absolutely. And he's obviously, as you mentioned, he's got a very high vision. I think fans and media are going to be a little skeptical, maybe a little encouraged by what he's saying, but we've just endured all these, a couple of hard years in a row here at Tennessee, and we're kind of like a new coach now, and what's going to be happening. But I think it is a little encouraging to hear that he's so optimistic about the future, even though we probably have pretty low expectations, especially this first year.
Yeah, definitely. And I'll kind of tie this in. I probably should have introduced it at the beginning, but the deal or the terms of his contract, the 6-year, $4 million per year deal. Jeremy Pruitt, I think, was making $3.8 million last year, but had already signed that contract extension that would have paid him $4.2 million. He turned down the pay raise due to COVID until what would have been this coming season that he will not end up getting paid for. But the one big thing that talking about the NCAA reason I want to tie it back in, 6-year deal with the possibility to be a 7-year deal if Tennessee has 2 seasons worth of bowl band or over 8 scholarship players or 8 scholarships taken away. I thought that 8 scholarships was an interesting term because with as much, and we had some stuff in our special issue today about it, with as many players that have transferred, I don't think Tennessee is hardly going to be close to that 75 scholarship mark for a couple of years since you can only bring in 25 in class. I was a little surprised that they put that number of 8. That felt a little low to me because I can almost see Tennessee implementing a 6 to 8 person or team scholarship loss for a few years just because they're going to be down it already.
Sure. Yeah, I totally agree. I was a little surprised by that as well. And I don't know. I guess just the punishment. It's just what's happened. This is the situation Tennessee's been forced into.
Yeah, definitely. It'll be interesting to see I think that the prevailing thought is that Tennessee would self-punish since they kind of handed everything. They did everything with the NCAA's holding the NCAA's hand, bringing them right along. So I think seems like their game plan here has been, we'll tell them everything, we'll self-punish. Hopefully that'll be enough. So that'll be interesting to see. That would make me think they're not thinking they're going to do a 2-year bowl ban. I wouldn't think you would have that extra year of extension for anything that you already planned on doing. But that'll certainly be something to wait and see in the coming weeks and months as that internal investigation winds down, and we'll see how long the NCAA stays on Tennessee's campus.
Sure.
Moving over to the transfer portal, we've had a little bit more news there this week. Keyshawn Lawrence entered and found a home in Oklahoma, and Eric Gray, who obviously we entered last week, we talked about some in our podcast on Monday, also going to Oklahoma. Oklahoma's kind of becoming Tennessee. I don't even know what area of the country Oklahoma is. West, Midwest, South, Southwest, somewhere Midwest. In that range. 3 players have now transferred there. But 2 players, major Tennessee players that announced intentions of transferring, in Henry To'oTo'o and Kavaris Crouch, both still enrolled in classes at Tennessee past the add drop date that was yesterday on Wednesday. What do you make of that? How important to Tennessee would it be if because both Crouch and To'oTo'o are not in Knoxville right now, though they are in classes doing those virtually. How big would that be if Heupel can get those guys back to Knoxville and at least going through things for the spring?
Sure. That would be huge. Talk about 2 leaders of your defense, a defense that was already not great last year. There's potential there, but in To'oTo'o, I think the leading tackler, he might have had the most sacks on the team. Just team leader, great clubhouse presence. That would be huge for Heupel and to get him back. And maybe with Pruitt gone, maybe that was the reason why To'oTo'o was out. We'll just have to see what Heupel can do. But that would be so big for Tennessee and their defense to get 2 linebackers like that back.
Yeah, and obviously I think Henry To'oTo'o is probably the best player on Tennessee's whole team, if not one of the best 2 or 3. Crouch isn't a great player, but he is a starter, a guy that plays a lot. I think what's so big about it is you just look at Tennessee's outside linebackers and inside linebackers since the end of the season, I mean, they've been decimated. You had Kevon Bennett got kicked off the team, I guess, before the season ended back in early December, maybe late November. DeAndre Johnson transfers back home to play at Miami. J.J. Peterson, Kavaris Crouch. I mean, that's Henry Toto. That's 5 linebackers you could be losing at it. The spot Tennessee really had no depth. So more than obviously Toto is a good player. Crouch is a solid player. More than anything, Tennessee just needs bodies there, because if not, they're going to be relying on sophomores and freshmen to play who have not played any meaningful snaps to be playing basically all the snaps next year.
Right. And I mean, we mentioned it earlier, with Heupel, kind of the reputation is that his team defense isn't great. And, just by nature of the offense. And so, getting, as you mentioned, any bodies that we can, and especially a couple of really solid ones in Toto and Crouch, that would be huge for Tennessee. But, we'll just have to wait and see if they change their minds with this new hiring.
So first thing kind of on business for Coach Heupel will be hiring his staff. What do you expect to see there? How much do you expect to see him bring guys for UCF? What are some potential names that you would think would be good ideas to bring on, or at least at the coordinators, not in the minor stuff?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, with the way Danny White brought his UCF coach over there, I wouldn't be surprised if, a lot of other UCF coaches might come up here following their head coach, because they had a lot of success down there, had a lot of good chemistry. But I guess kind of the biggest issue, probably the most prominent one, as you kind of alluded to earlier, is the defense and defensive coordinator. And I think Kevin Steele, he was a new defensive coach. I don't remember if he's a coordinator or not, but that was kind of Pruitt's last hire. So, if he sticks around, that'll be up to Heupel, or if he wants to fill that role with someone else, someone from UCF or regardless anywhere else. But that's, I think in my eyes, that's probably the most pressing matter on his staff right now.
Yeah, and I think Kevin Steele was brought on as just a defensive assistant, but obviously he's been an SEC defense coordinator, or I think Clemson was one stop, big level defense coordinator for a long time. I think that's a name that makes a lot of sense. I don't know where his mindset is. I'm sure he was wanting to get the Tennessee job. He was going after the Auburn job pretty hard earlier this offseason. Does he want to come in as an assistant for a guy he doesn't really know? I think that's going to be worth watching. One name that I will say on the offensive side of the ball is Jeff Lebby, Ole Miss's offensive coordinator.
Sure.
Was offensive coordinator at UCF under Heupel for 2 seasons. I think those two are really close. From talking to some people at Ole Miss, I think they expect Lebby to leave. I think the question is going to be, will Lebby get that Central Florida job? I think he's a major candidate there. He's a really hot up and coming offensive coach. If not, I think that would be, I expect that to be the first guy Heupel goes after. It's been his offense coordinator for 2 of his 3 years. He's really highly thought of. And to me, obviously it's less important on the offensive side of the ball just because Heupel has that past, but there's so much that goes into being the head coach at Tennessee. It's hard to be calling the plays, dialed into every single little offensive thing. Having someone you can fully trust on the offensive side, I think would go a long way to helping Heupel with all of the expectations and all the extra baggage and kind of noise that comes with the Tennessee job.
Yeah, you're absolutely right about that. So many responsibilities. It's just such a big job, as you mentioned, and having that offensive coordinator. And Ole Miss had a pretty good offense. They were scoring a lot of points, so that he's going to have success too. So that would be a good combination, I think, if he got that man for his offensive coordinator. But as you said, UCF, that would be an appealing job. So we'll just have to wait and see how Heupel plays it out, I guess.
Yep, and SEC kind of snuck it in on us on a very busy football day on Wednesday, but the SEC order of schedule comes out. Tennessee already knew who they were playing, but that finalizes Tennessee's 2021 football schedule. We will run through it here and give you some thoughts. Tennessee will open the Josh Heupel era on Saturday, September 4th against Bowling Green. Following week, they will host Pittsburgh. Week after that, September 18th, they'll host Tennessee Tech. September 25th, they travel to Florida for the first SEC game. Next week, they go to Columbia, Missouri to take on the Tigers, a former spot that Heupel was coached at. October 9th, South Carolina comes to Knoxville. October 16th, Ole Miss comes to Knoxville. Following week, Tennessee will go to Alabama. last week of October 30th, will be Tennessee's bye week before kind of the November home stretch that will be at Kentucky, home against Georgia, home against South Alabama, home against Vanderbilt. What are your thoughts? Obviously, we kind of knew who those opponents were going to be, but what do you see on the way the schedule was laid out, and what do you think will be kind of the expectations for Heupel's first season?
Sure. I mean, first off, I'm glad that it's 12 games again. I know hopefully the pandemic will be mostly resolved by then, when there'll be plenty of fans in Neyland and there'll be a good atmosphere. But that's kind of my first reaction. I mean, it looks like a pretty standard Tennessee schedule, but it's going to be a tough one for Heupel, and kind of a baptism by fire type deal. I mean, I'm looking here, you got a couple tough games traveling to Florida. That'll be a tough one. I'm sure the homecoming for him at Missouri, that'll be a big game. And then at Alabama, and even at Lexington against Kentucky. I mean, those are going to be some tough road games. And then, you still got to host Georgia. It's going to be a tough slate of games for Heupel in his first year. So, I mean, we were already kind of talking earlier about maybe what's his success going to look like in his first year, transitioning and everything. He's not getting it easy with this schedule.
Yeah, and there's certainly the normal barriers or struggles of the Tennessee schedule. You're gonna have to play 3 teams that are probably going to be in the top 10 with Florida, Georgia, and Alabama. In some ways, I do think the schedule does set up nicely for Tennessee. Probably my first takeaway when looking at it is that Georgia game is still in November. I know that was an early October game for a long, long time last year. The plan was to play it in November before COVID-19 changed everything, but there was kind of some uncertainty if that was just going to be a one-year thing or a long-term thing. And I don't really think that's good. I think that's very good for Tennessee, because you look at how their schedule oftentimes is winded up, and they're playing Florida, Georgia, Alabama in a 4 or 5 week span. And that just when you're as bad as Tennessee's been for the past decade and the depth they haven't had, that just decimates a team in the middle of the season. It's a little bit easier to have it stretched out. Florida on September 25th, October 23rd at Alabama, and November 13th against Georgia. So 3 or 4 weeks separating all of them. I think that makes it a little bit more manageable. And then the one thing that I really look at, I think 2 games that are going to be very, very critical for Heupel are going to come early in the season. That's that Pittsburgh game week 2 at home, and the South Carolina game on October 9th at home. 2 games that I think will really kind of be basically toss-ups. Tennessee maybe be a couple-point favorites, but you get both those games at home. I think you really have to win at least one of those games to make a bowl next year. But really, that's 2 games that if you win both of those, you're probably going to lose to Florida anyway. I think you really have some momentum and some confidence in a team that was beaten down last year. And that's going to be half the battle for Josh Heupel, is to get the confidence and in game we can win this kind of mindset back. That was a problem for Tennessee last season.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned it, 2 winnable games. Pittsburgh, they were a decent team last year, but not super great. Same with South Carolina. So, I mean, you got to think Tennessee should be, with the talent, some of the talent they got on their roster, they should be right in there. And as you said, I mean, losing those 2, that could be winnable, and some of these other tough games, it could be terrible for their confidence in the way they play to lose some of those. So, definitely 2 games to watch, 2 very critical ones for the season.
I'll stick it on you, not a record prediction, because we don't even have a heck of a clue what Tennessee's roster is going to look like in 3 months. But just looking at it, what do you think should be the goal for Josh Heupel in this first year?
Well, I would like to say win at least more than 3 games, because that's what they did last year. Maybe 6 or so. That might be a little ambitious, but I'd say win the games that you're supposed to, and at least be competitive in the games that you need to be competitive in, because, we just mentioned South Carolina and Pittsburgh. Tennessee should be competitive. It might be a toss-up going either way, but, at least stay competitive in the ones that you should be in, and take care of the ones that you can definitely take care of.
Yeah, I think that's a great point on being competitive, because Tennessee was far from that this year. Every single loss, double digits. And look, I'm not saying Josh Heupel needs to play Florida, Georgia, or Alabama real competitive next year. But besides those 3, there's not a team on Tennessee's schedule that they can't beat. Now, let's get this very clear. Tennessee's not going to go 9-3 next year. I think they're probably a 6-6 team, right in that range, 6-6, 5-7. with 6-6 being what should be the goal for Heupel. But you have games, Pittsburgh, Missouri, South Carolina, Ole Miss, Kentucky, Vanderbilt. You don't have to win all those games, but those teams aren't teams that should be blowing you out.
Mm-hmm.
Those teams are teams you should be competitive with. And that's what, again, granted, he's had a lot of talent at Central Florida, but Heupel did that really well. I think he just had one loss in 3 years that was by double digits, and that was his last game against BYU in the bowl game. So I think that'll be telling, maybe more than even the wins and losses, or just how competitive on a week in, week out basis Tennessee will be. And then one last thing on the way out on the schedule, October 16th matchup will be Lane Kiffin's return to Knoxville. I am sure that will be a fun one. Hopefully, like I said, what you said a minute ago with the pandemic, they can have as many fans in there as possible. Yeah. So I'm sure that'll be a anticipated one for Vol fans.
Yeah, a lot of people were hoping he might come back to Knoxville and be the next head coach. So I'm sure there's going to be a lot of bitter feelings towards them and with everything that happened. But that'll definitely be a fun one for sure.
Yeah, that's definitely a good point on how many Tennessee people wanted Kiffin to come back. But that will be it for this edition of the Checkerboard Chat. I am Ryan Shcumpert, joined by Joshua Lane. Appreciate you guys for joining us. Have a great rest of your week.